This video will review the concept of consideration. First, what is consideration? Well, we know that Restatement 71 requires that a contract include an exchange. There must be something given in exchange for something else. So the restatement says that to constitute consideration, a performance or return promise must be bargained for. The performance itself can consist of an act other than a promise, a forbearance, meaning an agreement that you're not going to do something, or the creation, modification, or destruction of a legal relation, the agreement to give up a legal right, for example. The performance or return promise can be given to the promisor or to someone else the promisor asks that it be given to, and it be given by the promisee or by some other person that the promisor is asking that it be given by. The requirement of exchange under Restatement 71 states that the return promise or performance must be bargained for. So it has to be sought by the promisor in exchange for his promise and given by the promisee in exchange for that promise. So it can't be incidental that there is a performance or a return promise. It must have been sought in exchange. For example, A offers to buy a book owned by B and to pay B $10 in exchange. The parties are agreeing that that will be their bargain. A receives a gift from B of a book worth $10, and subsequently A promises to pay B the value of the book. In this instance, the payment is not being sought in exchange for the book. So A's promise to pay B the value will not be enforceable because that's not what induced B to give A the book. Instead, A receives a gift from B of a book worth $10 and subsequently gives B a DVD worth $15. This is not a contract. It's not a bargain for exchange. Instead, it is a series of gifts because they're not being given in exchange for the other. The benefit detriment test comes from Hammer versus Sidway and states that consideration may be a benefit to the promisor or a detriment to the promisee. The problem in that instance was the nephew was told by the uncle that if he did not smoke, drink, curse, or gamble until the age of 21, the uncle would give him a sum of money. One of the arguments made against payment of the money is that all of these things that the nephew had to do were to his own benefit, and therefore there wasn't any consideration. But the rule says it could be a benefit to the promisor, meaning the uncle, or a detriment to the promisee, meaning the nephew. And in this instance, it was a legal detriment to the nephew because these were things that he could legally have done. The question is the party giving the gift receiving a benefit from the other party, or is that party receiving the gift suffering some detriment? Either one will constitute valid consideration. So the nephew won the case in Hammer versus Sidway because he had, in fact, given consideration in exchange for the promise. Another consideration is the difference between consideration and a condition. So the famous hypothetical is you tell a tramp, if you go around the corner to the clothing shop there, you may purchase an overcoat on my credit. The question is if you go around the corner to the clothing shop, is that some kind of consideration being given on the part of the tramp, or instead is that merely a condition in order to receive a gift? So you have to ask, if you go around the corner of the clothing shop, a condition, or is it consideration, which would make the promise to give an overcoat enforceable as a contract? Another example is, if you come over here, I will give you $500. The question is if you come over here consideration, or instead is this merely the condition for which what you have to fulfill in order to get the $500? When it's a close case, or when you're having trouble figuring out which it is, whether it's consideration or a condition, then the best thing to do is ask, does this condition somehow benefit the promisor? Because if it does, then it's more likely to be consideration. If instead it doesn't benefit the promisor, then it's likely that we're merely talking about a condition that is necessary for receipt of a gift. Remember that the rule requires there be a bargain for exchange. So one person is voluntarily assuming an obligation upon condition of an act or a forbearance by the other. The parties must adopt and regard something as consideration, as opposed to merely what's required in order to receive the gift. Some other rules concerning consideration. One is the mere pretense or nominal consideration will not be sufficient for enforcement of a promise. So for example, if a promise is made on a printed form that says for value received, that is not enough to constitute consideration. If in fact there was no value received as shown by the facts in the case. If the form just said that, then it's nominal consideration and it's not going to be valid. In addition, past consideration is not valid. So if an agreement to or a promise to give money to someone in exchange for things that that person has already done is not going to be considered consideration, because it's not in exchange for the gift. It's something that's already been done. Because of your many years of service, I am giving you a pension. That is not consideration. Instead, it's simply the motive for giving a gift. And finally, moral consideration is not valid either. So even though it might be the right thing to do for an employer to give the employee a pension because of their many years of service, this kind of consideration is not considered valid. Instead, there must be an actual exchange. Also important is the concept of inadequacy of consideration. As opposed to nominal consideration, which is where there really is no consideration at all, mere inadequacy is not going to void a contract. So arguing that you had a bad deal or it wasn't fair, that there's no equality on both sides of the deal, that will not void the contract. Instead, if there's any consideration, then the court will not inquire into whether it is in fact adequate. The court will simply ask, have they agreed to the exchange? And if so, there's consideration. Later on in the course, we'll discuss other reasons why a contract may be voided based on duress or other kinds of unfair considerations. But it's not a reason for you to say that there's no consideration or that consideration is inadequate, simply because it's a bad deal. In addition, we're going to discuss illusory consideration. A promise, even if it's bargained for, is not consideration if it is illusory, if it makes the performance entirely optional with the promisor. So it might sound like a promise, but if it makes the performance entirely optional with the promisor, it's not really a promise, it's illusory. For example, I promise to employ you as long as I choose. That leaves performance completely optional with the promisor, and it's not in fact a promise at all. So if there is no consideration, if the promise is illusory, then it is not valid. Finally, an option contract is an agreement to hold open an offer. It's an agreement on the part of the offeror to hold that offer open for a certain amount of time to give the offeree the chance to decide whether the offeree wants to accept it. Ordinarily, an offer is freely revocable until it has been accepted. If instead there's an option contract, then the offeror cannot revoke that offer during the time of the option. This does require its own consideration. So any agreement to hold an offer open is not going to be valid unless it is bound by consideration. There's return consideration. One thing that's confusing, though, is that here nominal consideration often is found to be adequate. It's the distinction between just holding an offer open and binding someone to another kind of performance. Here, nominal consideration will be found adequate by most courts. So, for example, holding an offer open in exchange for $1 or something very small will often be upheld by the courts. Also, the power of acceptance of an option contract is not terminated in all the ways that acceptance of a regular offer can be terminated. So if the offeree rejects the offer or gives a counteroffer, that will not revoke his power of acceptance for the time period of the option. Since he has given something in exchange for it, it's its own separate agreement. Similarly, the offeror cannot revoke until the period of the option is over. And if the offeror dies or becomes incapacitated, that will not revoke the offer either, although if it's not an option, an offer would be revoked by death or incapacity of the offeror. So an option contract is holding an offer open, and it will not be revoked for the normal ways that offers are often revoked. But there must be consideration given, and often a recital about nominal consideration here will be sufficient, even though it would not be sufficient for a normal offer, something other than an option.